Okay, hello guys. So my name's Talia, and I'm a test engineer at WeWork. I'm the founder of Women Who Test Tel Aviv, which is a community group that allows women engineers to come together and talk about testing. I am a testing and prod skeptic to practitioner. What do I like to do at work? I like to turn product requirements into test cases. I like breaking features before we launch them. But my favorite thing that I like to do at work is test my coworkers. So what do I mean by test my coworkers? I like to test their reactions to things that I think are funny, like when it's their birthday, when they're on vacation. Is anyone here a Warriors fan? No? Okay, we're like really far from California, so. Okay, so I want to tell you guys a story about when I was interviewing for a company. I went into the interview and I was in a state of mind that most interviewees are in. I was super nervous. I wanted to learn more about the company and the way things are done engineering-wise because I was interviewing for a test engineering position. So I'm in the interview and everything is going great and I feel so good. I feel so confident. I'm answering all the questions correctly. You know that feeling you get when you're in an interview and you know that you're doing well? So that was me in the interview. And then it was my turn to ask questions. So I asked the interviewer about the testing environment and who's responsible for the testing environment and how often do you dump production data onto staging and what's that process like? And he stopped me and said they don't have a staging environment, they test in production. Come again. I was so confused. And I was in a state of shock. I didn't understand what was going on. What do you mean you test in production? That's not a thing. People don't do that. I thought this was a trick question. I really didn't know what was going on. So then the interviewer had me do something, and I want you guys to do this too. So I want everyone to think about the last feature that your team deployed. Okay, you're thinking about it. You got it? Is it working? Right now? In production? How do you know? Your users haven't reported anything to you, your alarms haven't gone off, your PagerDuty alerts haven't gone off. So you assume that it works, but you don't know. Testing in production is the only way to know that your features are working right now in production. So let's define what testing in production is. It means testing your features in the environments that your features will live in. It means testing your features in the environments that your users will use those features. And it means not using a fake environment like staging or a QA environment or something like that. So what is it not? It's not a replacement for all testing. And more importantly, it's not the end of the world. And at the end of the day, I've never heard anyone speak highly of their staging environment. Oops, what's happening? So after the interview, I went home and I did my homework. Why have I never heard about testing in production? And if it's such a great thing, like why aren't more companies doing it? So I learned, and what I had experienced before I interviewed for this company is that most companies use a test environment, right? This is common. This is what people do. It's the standard. So raise your hand here if your company uses a staging environment, some sort of test environment. OK, great. Now keep your hand up if your staging environment is perfect. If there's nothing wrong with your staging environment, it's an exact replica of production, and there are never problems with it. Good, that's what I thought. So what's wrong with staging environments? Staging environments are really, really expensive to maintain. So companies spend millions and millions of dollars every year just to create and maintain these staging environments. Staging test results do not always match production test results because staging data does not match production data. So think of a time where you were working on a feature and you tested it in staging. You went through every possible test case. You went through this inside and out. You feel so good about this feature. It's perfect. You sat with the product person and it meets all the requirements and it works great. And then you deploy it to production and what happens? There's a bug. So staging test results don't match production test results because the data is different. Production includes data that staging doesn't have. So you're never going to know the differences between your production environments and your staging environments until you test in that environment. And no one cares if staging is broken. So picture this. You're in the middle of testing a really high priority feature, or you're fixing a bug that really needs to be fixed right away because it's a high priority, and you log into staging to fix it, but you get the 404 screen of death, and you ping the person in charge, but he doesn't answer, and then you ping someone else, but he's at lunch, so he tells you to open an IT ticket, and then when you open the IT ticket, it has to be approved by your manager, but they're in a meeting, so they don't respond to your message. And meanwhile, you have this really high priority bug, and you really need to fix it, and you're on a time crunch, and really no one cares. No one cares if staging is broken. No one's going to get a call in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner if staging is down. The load in staging does not match production. So you're never going to be able to get performance results from staging, because think of the number of people who use your app, who use your product in staging, and then think of the number who use your product in production. It's completely different. Oops, oops, oops. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. Like, that's nice, Talia. Like, testing in production, it's a great idea to have, but I can't. Like, I have to use my staging environment. But I used to think this too. But what's the first thing you do right after you deploy a feature? You go to production and you test it, right? So testing in production only works when the whole team owns product quality. So contrary to popular belief, it's not the test engineer's job to ensure product quality. The whole team is responsible for this. Testing in production only works when you test early and often. So having your tests run incrementally every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, every whatever increment you decide is really important, because that's how you know that your features are constantly working. And I also learned that what stops most companies from testing in production is fear. So they're too afraid of the risks, and they don't have trust in their systems. So think about it. Companies don't test in production because of fear and lack of trust in their systems. And for the same reason, they refuse to engage in the tools and process changes that will engage that trust. So I know this is risky. I know that testing in production has its risks. It can affect real end users. So if your test entities interact with real data rather than other test entities, you're going to be in trouble. It can affect reporting and analytics, which can affect business decisions. So if your test users are not excluded from your reporting and analytics, and they're performing actions, and those click events or those events go into your Looker or your Datadog, or not Datadog, into Looker, or what's the other one? There's another one that I forgot the name of, but if you don't exclude your test data from your real data, you're going to have a problem. And it can also affect the third parties that your software is integrated with. So you need a way to differentiate test data and real data so that your third parties are not affected in any way. So I'm going to show you how to do it safely, and we're going to address the risks together, because I know that you guys are dying to know. Okay, so the first step is to install the necessary tools. So the first tool that you need that's really essential when you're testing in production is feature flagging. And it's a way to see who sees which features at runtime, and you're able to hide, enable, or disable features. So this is like how I envision feature flagging. Each feature is written by our developers and launched into a feature flag, and only the people who are targeted in that feature flag will be able to see any changes related to that feature. And then those green people, anyone who's not in the feature flag, they cannot see any changes related to that feature because they're not targeted in the feature flag. So while the feature flag is off, we would go in and we would open any defects. We would test all of the requirements, verify all of the proper design. It was in this time where we did all of our testing while the feature flag was off, and while we, as the dev team, were the only people who could see anything related to that feature. So if there were bugs in our new feature, only we could see them. No one else on the outside world, no one else who was not targeted in the feature flag could see anything related to that feature. So the bugs were fixed before the feature flag was turned on and before our users ever saw anything wrong. So we also created test users in production, which are these bots, and we put those inside of our feature flag, and I will come back to that. So once we fixed all the bugs and we verified all of our proper functionality, we would turn on the feature flag, already knowing 100% that our feature is working in production and we didn't break anything else that was existing. So we would repeat this process for every new feature, and this allowed us to have a safe way of testing in production without affecting real end users. So I'm going to go through what this looks like in Split.io. This is a tool that we use for feature flagging. So all you have to do is go to the UI and you hit Create Split. You choose a name for your feature flag. I'm going to call this one Really Cool Feature. You select a traffic type. Who do you want to see this feature? So you can differentiate between employee, location, user. So I'm going to do it by user because I only want the people who are in the feature flag to see it and the people who are not to not be able to see it. So after you create your feature flag, you have to create targeting rules, like who specifically are these people. So I'm going to say I want myself to see it, I want my robot to see it, I want a developer to see it, and I want my designer to see it. That's it. Everyone else cannot see anything related to this feature. And then in the code, I'm going to say, if this really cool feature is on, then I'm going to do the action that corresponds to that feature flag. And if it's not on, I'm going to do something else. So then in the test, it makes it really easy because I'm going to log in with that same user that was in the feature flag, perform whatever actions I need to validate, and then expect that feature to work. And the best part about this, the cherry on top of the cake, was that when we turned on this feature flag, we already knew that our features were working and we didn't break anything that was existing. So the next tool that you need is some sort of automation framework. Why do we need an automation framework? Because you can't test everything manually after you deploy it. Believe me, I've tried. You're going to want an automation framework that's easy to adopt, easy to debug, one that has good reporting, and one that has a good support community. And this is really important when something goes wrong and you need help. Another thing that you need is a job scheduler. So you want to know as often as possible that your critical flows are working. So think of the longest possible time you'd want to know if a critical flow is failing. You can also have two groups of tests, one group of critical tests that runs more often and one group of less critical tests that runs less often. So one of the questions that comes up is why not just continuously run the tests? It's overkill. You can set up your tests to run in your build pipeline as well if you don't want to have it run on a specific cadence. And you want to trust your tests. Something that I like to do when I'm writing my tests, I watch my tests run. I watch them run, and I make sure that it's doing everything that I need it to do. And then when I run the tests, when they run in the cloud, I know that they're already doing what they need to do because I've seen them run. Okay, so the next thing that you need is an alerting tool, and you're going to want to choose something that can be integrated with your job scheduler. So you also need a rotation of who's on call to handle these alerts, because remember, the whole team owns product quality. Okay, so for tools for testing in production, these are all the tools that I've used. So for feature flagging, launched directly in Split. For an automation framework, I've used Robot, Puppeteer, and Protractor. And for a job scheduler, I've used Jenkins and Circle CI. And for alerting, I've used PagerDuty and Slack. So I'm sure there's more that can be used here, but these are the ones that I have used. Okay, so after you install all of your tools, the next thing that you need to do is create your test data. So we need a way to create and manipulate test data in production without affecting end users and without affecting any data and analytics. So what we did was we created a consistent naming convention for all of our test users. So these test users acted like real people, and they looked like real people, but we knew that they were test users because in the back end, there was a flagging system that was used to identify these test entities. So we had On the back end, we had this flagging system, and then the name of these users would contain a certain string that we would know that these are test users. So if it was robot1, if the string of the username included the word robot or the word whatever your company decides, that's how you know that this is a test user. And also there's a prop or there's something on the back end that says this is a test entity. So it's really important for your company. You're going to have your own test entities, whether it's a test group or a test user or a test whatever, that you have some sort of identifying system that you can use to identify test entities and real entities. And this is how you can manipulate your testing in production, because you're following these specific predetermined guidelines. And this is something that you need to do before you start so that you have this concrete solution. Okay, so the next step is to write your tests. So I like to write my tests in BDD because it's really easy for my product person to understand what the test is doing when I use given, when, then, just classic Gherkin. So whether or not you use BDD or not, it's really important that you have as much visibility into what the test is doing so that when any step fails, you know exactly what went wrong. The other thing you have to do is have really good setup and teardown when you're testing in production. So before every test, you clear cookies and you perform the right login. During the test, you want to perform whatever actions you need to validate, validate whatever functionality you need. And then in the teardown, you want to undo any actions. This is your cleanup time. And the most important thing here to remember is that if any step fails, whether it's the setup or the test or the teardown, you get alerted immediately and the test stops. So a lot of times what I see is that your alerting system is only scheduled to be triggered when part of the test fails, but not when the setup or teardown fails. So it's really important that any part of the setup, testing, or teardown process, if any part of that fails, that you have some sort of alerting system. Okay, so the next thing is to deploy to a production canary. So what's a production canary? It's when you slowly roll out your change to a small subset of users before you roll it out to your entire user base. And this minimizes the impact if something goes wrong. And why is it important to use a production canary? Because it provides risk mitigation. So if something went wrong in the feature flagging process, if for some reason there was a bug that was deployed that you didn't catch, do you want 100% of your users to encounter this issue or 1%? It allows you to quickly identify the issue, roll back to a good version, and fix the issue in a controlled environment. So this is how you set up your canary in Split or Netlify. The user interface is pretty simple. You just there's a toggle, and you decide what % of your users you want to allocate your traffic to. So what if there's an issue with your canary code? So all you have to do is analyze the issue and figure out, is it okay if my users see this? If yes, keep the canary as is and fix the bug. And if no, then return the canary to 0% traffic and fix the bug. Okay, so for risk mitigation, before launch, use feature flagging to target your users, and after launch, use production canaries to limit your audience. So the outcome of this process was really, really outstanding. So our entire team, from our developers to product to design, everyone had higher confidence in our releases because we already knew that our features were working in the environments that they will live in. We also increased developer velocity and were therefore able to release features faster because our developers spent less time fixing bugs and more time delivering value to our users. So while testing in production, this is a way of being proactive rather than reactive. I don't want to wait for something to go wrong, have someone to report it to me, and then fix it. I want to find the issue, fix it, I want to find the issue and fix it before anyone ever sees anything wrong, right? So whenever something went wrong or something broke, our tests would fail, we would immediately get alerted, we would analyze the issue and resolve it as soon as possible. And this minimized our user interaction with bugs and defects, and it really ensured a really good user experience. So just a quick note on performance testing in production. Yes, it's possible. You want to do it at a time with low traffic and be prepared for outages. And it's better to do it on purpose and control the outcome than have it happen to you unexpectedly. So when you're testing in production with third parties, you can work with your third parties to be able to identify test data and real data. So something you can do is set up a header in your API request so that everyone knows that if a request comes in with this header, then it's going to be marked as test data and not be processed. So what if you can't test in production? What if you work for a bank or you work for some sort of medical device company or something that has to do with human lives or something where you really just can't test in production? What I would suggest is spinning up a containerized environment per build. You can use Docker to spin up your microservices, but remember, the more dependencies you have, the more complicated this is going to get. So just some notes on testing on a containerized environment. You need to know which version of Docker will be used in production and test against those versions. You also need to run separate tests for each individual microservice as well as all of them together. Hackers are also targeting these systems that are hosted in containers, and they're not secured properly. There's a ton of information online about this if you haven't already read it. And also, it's really expensive to spin up an environment. Especially when you have a lot of developers, this gets super, super pricey. So it's good, testing in a containerized environment, just not as good. So what about other non-production tests? So staging environments can still be used for pre-production testing, okay? And it's really important for financial systems. Has anyone here heard of SOX compliance? Does that exist here? Is that just a thing in the States? Okay, cool. So things that have to do with SOX compliance should be tested ahead of time and not in production. And anything that has to do with privacy or data, those should also be tested ahead of time to minimize any sort of data breaches. So when we think about where these production tests operate, if you think of a bubble with all of our tests, inside that we have another bubble with all of our end-to-end flows, and within that you have your production tests. And notice that not all of your end-to-end tests are going to be production tests because of these privacy issues and data issues. So let's talk about shifting your company's testing culture. So if this is something that you wanted to do, I would start by explaining why the pros outweigh the cons for your company. So is your staging environment unreliable, which from earlier, it's unreliable? Are there frequently issues that you think could have been caught if you were testing in production? These are the things that you should talk about with your manager, with your dev team to figure out if this is something that you would benefit from. You also want to use examples from the past. So do you remember when we merged XYZ and it caused this big issue in production? Do you think if we tested it in production that this issue could have been caught? You also want to propose a path forward. So have you heard about this cool thing called feature flagging? If this is something that your company hasn't been doing, hasn't been using feature flagging, I would ask if you can take some time in the next sprint or in the next whatever few weeks to see if you can benefit from it. Think about if you were to start testing in production, which tests would bring you the most value? So we used to be scared of deploying new features. We used to have debates of whether or not we wanted to deploy code on Fridays. So we don't fight about whether or not we want to deploy code on Fridays anymore. We fight about other things. Once we started moving more and more code to testing in production, these discussions and this fear stopped. And the lead time to know if something was wrong was reduced, and our confidence in our releases really increased. Okay, so there's always going to be those people who say, testing in production will never work, just stick to staging, this is what the standard is, this is what most companies do, and this is what I say to those people. Number one, staging will never fully represent production. Number two, staging is a sunk cost. And number three, they're not my target audience. They will either get on board or die off. Okay, so if this is something that you wanted to do, there's really some easy steps to do it. The first one is to install your tools, your feature flagging, your automation framework, your job scheduler, and your alerting tool. You're going to want to carefully create your test data and make sure your test entities only interact with each other. Then you're going to want to write your test, so make sure that your teardown cleans up your test, make sure that your setup sets up your test correctly, and that every part of the testing process has an alerting system set up. Launch your feature behind a feature flag, deploy to a production canary, and have a drink. Okay, so in case you weren't paying attention at all the past 35 minutes, I want you to take away two things. The first one is that no one cares if your feature is working in staging. We care if it works in production. And the only way to know if it's working in production is to test it in production. Okay, so that's all.